They used to laugh at our words. When I was a boy, the white teachers in the boarding school washed our mouths out with soap if we spoke Navajo. I remember the sting of lye on my tongue, the smell of cracked wood desks and dried ink, and the silent stares from the other boys as I stood with my nose to the wall. My name is Shash Yazi. Shash means bear in Navajo. I come from the mesas of Chinle, near Canyon de Chelly. My grandfather fought in the Long Walk, though the history books rarely mention him. My father was a silversmith, quiet and strong. My mother, a weaver with calloused hands and the kind of patience that could tame the wind. We were poor, but not broken. The land raised us. The sheep, the wind, the sandstone, the stories. We were told to be proud of who we were, that our language was sacred. But the world didn't think so, not until they needed it. The recruiter came in late 1942, after Pearl Harbor, after the Marines had begun bleeding in the Pacific. We didn't get newspapers in Chinle, but the whispers came fast. Guadalcanal, Wake Island, Bataan. The Japanese were taking everything. I was 19 and wanted to see the ocean. They said they needed men who could speak Navajo and English. The Marines were forming a special communications unit, not with radios or wires, but with voices. A code, they called it, one the Japanese wouldn't understand. Suddenly, the same language that got us whipped in school was top secret. We were sworn in at Fort Wingate, then shipped to Camp Pendleton. There were 29 of us at first, the original Code Talkers. I was part of the second wave. The code was already written, based on our language, but twisted just enough that even a fluent speaker wouldn't catch its meaning without the key. Words like Twe Hona A for tortoise, that meant tank. Beish Dudwiz, ironfish, that meant submarine. We used birds for planes, storms for ships, and the rhythm of our ancestors to send fire across oceans. They didn't give us much time to learn. We trained hard, learned how to send and receive code at lightning speed, memorized hundreds of word substitutions, phonetic spellings, and tactics. Most of the white officers thought we were radio men. Some called us Code Indians. Some didn't trust us at all. But a few, especially the ones who bled, learned fast how much they needed us. We were fast, we were precise, and most of all, our code couldn't be broken, not once. In early 1943, they shipped us to the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal. I remember stepping off the Higgins boat into ankle-deep water, clutching my rifle and the heavy field radio strapped to my back. The air smelled like rot and sweat and something ancient. It rained every day. The jungle buzzed like a million angry wasps, snipers in trees, mud in your boots. Sleep was a myth. We lived in holes and moved like ghosts. Our job was simple: send messages faster than the enemy could kill us, from one squad to another, from command to the line, from the front to the artillery. One night we were pinned down on a ridge outside the Matanikau River, surrounded. The Japanese were trying to cut us off. I crawled through the mud with Corporal Whitehorse, my spotter, to a collapsed machine gun nest. He set up the radio. I spoke into the handset. Twe Honae approaching from east. 3 translation. 3 enemy tanks advancing from the east. Seconds later, our own artillery responded, a roar of fire from the jungle that shook the ridge. We held the line, barely. The lieutenant said our message saved the entire flank, but not everyone made it. I still remember the sound Whitehorse made when the mortar hit. Not a scream, just a silence that rushed in too fast. I carried his dog tags in my pocket for 3 months, never told his family what he looked like at the end. Some truth stay buried with the jungle. After that, I stopped speaking Navajo outside transmissions. Not because I was ashamed, but because it reminded me of the faces that didn't come back. And still, we kept sending messages, through Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu. The islands bled, and we bled with them. But the Japanese never cracked our code. Not once. Sometimes, between battles, I'd sit on the edge of the beach and speak softly into the radio. Nothing but the words of the wind, or a song my mother sang when I was small. Just to remember. And to think, the language they once tried to beat out of me was now saving lives. When I first saw Tarawa, it looked like a painting gone wrong, blue water like glass, palms leaning toward the sea, a thin strip of land floating in an endless Pacific, as if God had forgotten to finish the island. Then we got closer. The water turned red before we ever touched shore. I had seen war on Guadalcanal, but Tarawa was different. They told us the island was only 2 miles long, flat, easy, a 3-day job, one officer said, but the Japanese had dug in, hundreds of bunkers, trenches, pillboxes. Their general had promised the emperor we wouldn't take it in 100 years. We took it in 3 days, but at what cost? I was 20 now, older than I felt, still the same name, Shash Yazzie, still the same voice on the radio, but inside, something was wearing thin. We hit the beach on November 20th, 1943. Low tide, too low. The Higgins boats couldn't make it to shore, so we waded, hundreds of us, through chest-high water for over 500 yards under machine gun fire. Bullets cracked the ocean. Men screamed and sank. Radios were ripped from backs. I saw one Marine pull a wounded buddy across the coral, only for a shell to take them both. I held the handset in my teeth and my rifle in one arm. I made it to shore dragging a satchel of replacement parts. My knees were bleeding from the coral, and I lost my helmet to a wave, but I was alive. That was the rule in Tarawa. If you touched land, you were lucky. They say 18,000 Marines landed. Over 1,000 died, most in the first few hours. I dug into a crater with a few other code talkers, including Ben Nez from Shiprock and Thomas B. Gay, a younger recruit who had lied about his age. We rotated shifts, sending coordinates to the artillery ships offshore and translating recon from forward scouts. I remember one night, crouched beside a burning Japanese tank. The metal hissed and there were bodies everywhere. American, Japanese, hard to tell. Thomas sat beside me, carving a turtle into his rifle butt. "Why a turtle?" I asked. He shrugged. "Turtle never rush, but he always arrives." He was right, but few of us would arrive whole. By the 3rd day we had moved inland. The Japanese fought to the last man, and some didn't wait for bullets. One bunker we cleared held 2 Japanese soldiers and 3 grenades with the pins pulled. I translated a message from command. Flamethrowers to breach pillboxes on East Sector. I relayed it in Navajo. Moments later, the entire horizon seemed to burn. The air stank of gasoline and death. That night, we found a shallow grave. 24 Marines who had tried to flank a trench. Some had their helmets still on. One had a letter from home clutched in his hand, soaked in blood. Thomas didn't speak for 2 days after that. On the last night, we took Betio, the final Japanese stronghold. We called in coordinates through choking smoke, our radios barely holding power. We spoke fast, clear, exact. They say the Japanese never cracked the code, even when they captured one of our radios, because to understand it, they'd need to understand us, and they never did. When the guns fell silent, there was nothing left but shells, sand, and ghosts. We walked the beaches and saw the tide pulling back red and black. I stood beside a bulldozer trench where they laid rows of bodies, friend and foe alike. They said it was the only way. The heat, the disease, there was no time. I picked up a single USMC dog tag half buried in the sand and read the name, Joseph Running Deer. I had known him, just briefly, a Cheyenne from Montana. He told me once that he missed the mountains more than his own family. I kept his tag. I still have it. Later, when the press came to photograph Tarawa, they called it a necessary sacrifice, a victory for freedom. But to me, it was an island of bones, an island where every wave whispered a name. One night, weeks later, I sat alone on a transport ship back to Hawaii. I closed my eyes and spoke aloud, not into a radio, but into the night. I said the words of my grandfather, Ta shudidu shu hozho. All is beautiful within me. Because if I didn't say it, I might forget what beauty even meant. They called it the gateway to Japan, Saipan, bigger than Tarawa, a real island, mountains, villages, cane fields, and civilians, thousands of them. We were told the Japanese would fight harder here, not just for territory, but for pride, for home. They weren't wrong. We hit the beaches of Charankanoa on June 15, 1944. The Navy opened up with the biggest bombardment I'd ever seen. Battleships and cruisers hammering the coast for days before we landed. But when we went in, the fire came anyway, snipers in palm trees, mortars from caves, hidden machine gun nests dug into coral ridges. We lost dozens of men before I even made it to dry land. I remember crawling through black sand mixed with shattered shells, my boots filled with seawater and ash. The sky overhead was thick with smoke, and the rain started just as the tanks moved in. It didn't wash the blood away. I worked with a group of 5th Marine Division scouts near the southern ridge. My job was the same, send coded messages. But here, everything was louder. The battle didn't stop at night. Japanese banzai charges came through the dark, screaming, stabbing with bayonets, blowing themselves up with grenades. You'd fall asleep for minutes at a time, with your boots still on, sometimes still holding the mic. One morning, Captain Thompson, a red-faced man from Nebraska, pointed at me and said, "Yazzie, get me artillery fire now." He handed me a scribbled grid. The Japanese had overrun part of the ridge. Our men were getting cut down. I spoke fast, faster than I ever had before. Nahasdzan yilti chiz dutwiz wichi wizinigi. Translation, Earth speaks, shells on red-black hill. Seconds later, the hill exploded. Earth and bodies flung skyward. The flames turned the rain into steam. The captain looked at me like I was some kind of magician, but I wasn't magic, just fast. By the second week, we'd pushed into the interior. Japanese civilians, mostly Okinawan farmers, were caught between the fighting. Some were told that we would torture them, eat them. One night I saw a woman holding a baby run from the woods, chased by Marines. She reached the cliff edge and jumped. The baby's scream was the last thing I heard before the wind swallowed it. I never forgot that. They called it Marpy Point, a suicide cliff. Hundreds of civilians jumped. Some pushed their children first. It made you question everything. What kind of war tells mothers to leap into death rather than surrender? I didn't send a single message that day, not one word. Later, during cleanup, I passed by one of the smaller cliffs. A group of Marines stood silently around a single grave. The chaplain said a prayer in English. I asked if I could say one in Navajo. He nodded, so I sang a protection song, not for us, for the souls of those who jumped, who screamed, who drowned in fear. One of the Marines cried, didn't even hide it. The next week we caught a break. For a day there was no shelling, no gunfire, just quiet. I sat under a banyan tree and carved into my canteen. Saipan. June, fire and rain. Then I pulled a letter from my pack, one my sister had written back in Chinle. She said our youngest brother had enlisted, said my mother still left a chair empty at dinner. For me, I smiled, but only on the outside. We finally declared Saipan secure on July 9th, but even then the cave still whispered. We found dozens of bodies hidden in the hills. Many had taken their own lives. Others had been burned alive when we used flamethrowers to clear out the tunnels. It was hard to call it a victory. After the battle, I sat near the wreckage of a Zero fighter, its nose buried in the mud, the cockpit glass shattered. Inside, still strapped in, was the pilot, young, maybe my age. His face was frozen in a grimace of surprise or maybe fear. I said another prayer, because in another life we might have been friends, farmers, sons, storytellers. But here we were just ghosts passing each other in the smoke. They told us Peleliu would be over in 4 days. The top brass said the island had no mountains, no jungle, nowhere to hide. Just a strip of coral and sand. They said it would be fast. One final punch to protect MacArthur's flank before he returned to the Philippines. They lied. We hit the beach on September 15th, 1944. I was with the 1st Marine Division, part of the assault on White Beach too. The island glowed with heat. It wasn't just hot, it boiled. Sweat baked into your uniform before you even moved. The coral reflected the sun so hard it burned your eyes, and the moment the ramps dropped, the sky opened up with machine gun fire. The Japanese had dug tunnels into the coral hills, whole networks. They didn't defend the beaches like at Saipan. No, they waited. Let us come in. Let us choke in the heat and confusion. And then they struck. By nightfall, the beaches were soaked in blood. There were no trees for cover, just coral rock, sharp as bone, hot as coals. Men died from bullets, yes, but also from heat stroke, from thirst, from infection. I saw one of our runners collapse in the sun, lips blistered, skin peeling. He hadn't been hit by anything. He just shut down. My job stayed the same. Radio in Navajo, relay positions, guide the artillery. But the heat made the radios fry, the metal burned your skin, and the batteries failed faster than usual. Sometimes I had to rotate 2 packs just to get a clean message out. One night, deep in the scrub near Bloody Nose Ridge, I got a transmission from command. Enemy positions in Cave 3A. Request shelling. I translated it into Navajo and sent it fast. Minutes later, the ridge exploded, smoke and flame pouring from the rock. I could swear I heard voices screaming in Japanese, echoing down the coral like the island itself was mourning. That was Peleliu, a place where the earth screamed back. I carried the radio for 3 weeks without rest. Slept under tanks, in shell holes, once in the open with a poncho over my face just to block the sun. Food was scarce, water was worse. The medics handed out salt tablets to keep us from passing out. They didn't work. One day, I was paired with a squad moving to clear the northern caves. I walked point with a young Marine named Rosenbaum, a kid from Chicago who carried a picture of a girl back home. Annie, he called her. We were passing through a ravine when the ground erupted, a landmine. Rosenbaum was gone before I hit the dirt, just gone. The photo floated down beside my boot like a falling leaf. I picked it up, wiped the ash off her face, folded it and kept it in my pocket for the rest of the war. I still have it. By the 3rd week, our numbers were thinning. Men were hallucinating from heat and exhaustion. I began to talk to the radio like it was a person, called it Shadi, the word for older brother. It helped to pretend someone was listening. One morning, we reached a ridgeline overlooking a field of bones, Japanese and American both, sun-bleached, tangled, their rifles still clutched in skeletal hands. Someone whispered, "This place was never meant for us." I thought about that a long time. By mid-October, we declared most of the island secure, but the Japanese held out in the caves for weeks more. Even in late November, they were still ambushing patrols, still refusing to surrender. Some nights, you'd hear voices, low chants coming from the hills, not cries, not threats, just songs, warrior songs, maybe prayers, maybe ghosts. On the last day, we found a radio operator holed up in a collapsed tunnel, still alive. He hadn't eaten in 10 days, covered in dust. He looked at me and whispered something in Japanese. I didn't know the words, but the way he said them, it wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it sounded like regret. After Paleliu, we were pulled back to Pavuvu to rest. I spent hours soaking my feet, peeling skin off in strips, watching rain fall off palm fronds. I thought of home, of Chinle, of my grandfather, and of Annie. There was no green on Iwo Jima, no trees, no jungle, just volcanic rock, black as coal, sharp as broken glass. The sand was like ash, and it sucked at your boots like quicksand. You could smell sulfur in the air, rotten eggs and burnt powder, long before the landing craft ever touched the beach. We called it the closest thing to hell on Earth. I was 22 when we landed on February 19, 1945. I'd been through Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Paleliu, but nothing prepared me for Iwo. We were told it would take maybe a week. In truth, it took over a month, and more than 26,000 Americans were killed or wounded. I watched that black rock eat entire platoons alive. Our landing zone was Green Beach, just south of Mount Suribachi. The bombardment had been constant for days. The Navy turned the mountain into a smoking crater. But the Japanese hadn't fired a shot during the approach. It made you think maybe they're all dead. Then, as soon as the fifth wave hit the beach, they opened up. Hundreds of hidden guns in pillboxes, bunkers, caves, all coordinated. Machine guns from high ground, mortars from tunnels, snipers from invisible nests. It was a slaughter. Men fell into the black sand like rag dolls. The wounded screamed, and the dead said nothing. The radios crackled with panic. I hit the beach carrying a field radio, a Navajo code book memorized in my head, and nothing but adrenaline keeping me upright. Within the hour, I had already translated 3 urgent calls, requests for reinforcements, ammo, and artillery strikes. The signalmen screamed positions. I turned them into code and broadcasted them in seconds. Our words were clean. The Japanese couldn't break them. But no code can shield you from shrapnel. My spotter, Frank Chi, was hit by a mortar near hour 3. I dragged him behind a wrecked Sherman tank, screaming into the mic while blood soaked his side. He survived, but never spoke above a whisper again. Mount Suribachi loomed above us for days. It wasn't until February 23rd, after 5 days of brutal fighting, that a small Marine unit climbed to the summit and raised the American flag. I wasn't there when it happened. I was in a crater near the airfield, trying to call in fire support to stop a counterattack, but when I heard the cheers on the radio, I knew. Everyone did. The photo went around the world, but what they don't tell you is, that wasn't the end. That was day 5 of 36. The Japanese still had thousands of men in the northern caves, and they fought with the desperation of people who knew they wouldn't leave the island alive. Every inch had to be burned, blasted, or buried. We used flamethrowers, satchel charges, and endless artillery. I called in strikes so close to our lines the ground shook beneath my knees. Sometimes we cleared one cave, only to be shot at from another that hadn't even been mapped. I began to dream in code. My hands moved in my sleep. One night, while sleeping behind the lines, I was awoken by a Marine nudging my shoulder. "Yazzie, it's your people." I looked up. 4 Navajo Code Talkers had been assigned to our sector. One was Pete Nez, who I hadn't seen since Camp Pendleton. We sat around a ration fire and spoke in our language, not for code, not for mission, just for memory. We told jokes, laughed about old boarding school teachers. Someone sang part of a song our mothers used to hum while weaving. In that moment, for just a while, we were home. But the battle raged on. By March 6th, we had cleared the Central Plateau. By March 16th, most organized resistance had collapsed, but the diehards kept coming. Suicide charges, traps, last stands in caves no wider than coffins. The last time I used the code on Iwo was on March 24th. We were coordinating with air support to hit a final ridge near the northern cliffs. I transmitted, "Doli Yaji bi hashte hojo." Little bluebird carries thunder. Bombs dropped minutes later. The last stronghold crumbled. When the island was declared secure on March 26th, I walked alone to a ledge overlooking the ocean. I saw the beach, now quiet, littered with spent shell casings, helmets, the ghost of what we had done. Over 6,800 Americans died on Iwo. Nearly all of the 21,000 Japanese defenders were killed. Some civilians, too. No prisoners, no mercy, just ash. Before I left the island, I knelt in the black sand and pressed my palm to the earth. Then I whispered, "Thank you, grandfather, for the voice you gave me," because our words had carried us through again, but the burden was growing heavy. They told us this would be the final push, the battle to break the empire, Okinawa, the largest amphibious assault in the Pacific. Over 180,000 American troops, thousands of ships, aircraft carriers, battleships, flame tanks, rockets, everything. And still, we bled for every inch. We hit the beaches on April 1st, 1945. Easter Sunday. I remember the strange calm as we landed. No resistance on the beach, no machine guns, no shells. Some Marines even joked it was a trap, which it was. The Japanese had fallen back into the ridges, dug in like ticks, and let us come ashore. Let us build up, feel safe. And then the sky fell. Within a week, it was chaos. The rain came down in sheets mixing with mud and blood and fire. Artillery fire echoed constantly from Shuri Line, where the Japanese had made their stand. They had tunnels everywhere, connecting caves and pillboxes like veins under the skin of the island. I was assigned to the 6th Marine Division, pushing through the southern end of the island. My job was still code, transmit, translate, relay. The words came fast, and so did the losses. We were losing hundreds of men a day, sometimes to bullets, more often to shrapnel, artillery, even kamikaze attacks from the sky. I remember a hill we called Sugarloaf. It was small, just a lump of coral and clay, but we fought over it for 10 days, took it, lost it, took it again. Thousands died on that single hill. I sent messages from a shallow trench just beneath the crest, calling in artillery, air support. My fingers never stopped moving. The radio never cooled. We used phrases like "Tu bikini tse bika da na sha." The crab crawls atop the stone. Code for enemy tanks breaching the line. Each phrase I sent out meant lives, sometimes saved, sometimes lost. There was no front line in Okinawa, just fog and death. 1 minute you were safe, the next you were covered in blood. Marines cracked under the pressure. Some went catatonic, others got reckless. I saw one private, just 18, walk into a mortar blast without flinching. He hadn't slept in 5 days. He didn't scream. He just disappeared. The civilians haunted me most. There were thousands of them caught between armies. Some hid in caves with Japanese soldiers. Others ran into our lines waving white flags made from sheets or rice bags. I remember an old woman who approached us carrying a child. The child had been dead for hours. She didn't know. She kept humming a lullaby as we tried to take the body from her arms. One day I followed a squad into a cave to clear it. We tossed a grenade first, then went in with flashlights. Inside were 3 Japanese soldiers and a family of Okinawans. All dead, except for one boy, maybe 8, who crouched in a corner with his hands over his ears. His eyes were wide with terror, but he didn't cry. I dropped my rifle and knelt. In Navajo, I whispered, "Ta shudi, du shil hojho." It's okay. There is still beauty with me. Of course, he didn't understand the words, but I like to think he understood the voice. By late May, we had reached the southern cliffs. The Japanese made their last stand at Shuri Castle, a fortress turned fortress again. The rain hadn't stopped for weeks. The earth was a swamp of corpses and gunfire. My boots never dried. I sat in a shell crater with a broken antenna, sending messages with my backup radio. The battery was down to fumes. I had to whisper just to keep the signal clean. That night I looked up at the sky, lightning flickering behind clouds, and thought of home, of canyon winds and summer rain back in Chinle. This was not that rain, this was the kind that burned. On June 22, 1945, Okinawa was declared secure, but it was hard to say who had won. Over 12,500 Americans died, more than 100,000 Japanese troops, and nearly 150,000 civilians, lost, burned, crushed, drowned. Okinawa was not a battle, it was a funeral. After the island was secure, I walked to the edge of Maida Escarpment, looking out over the ocean. It was quiet. The smoke had cleared. I thought of every message I had sent, every code I had spoken, every word that had meant life or death, and I realized that my language, our language, had never been broken. But we had. They flew me out of Okinawa in late June. I wasn't wounded, not on the outside, but I couldn't stop shaking, couldn't eat. I started stuttering, even when I spoke in Navajo, my first language, the one I was supposed to trust like my own heartbeat. The medics thought it might be exhaustion, or heat stroke, or maybe malaria. I knew better. Whatever it was, it had settled somewhere deeper. A wound that didn't bleed. They sent me to a recovery station in Guam, a quiet place compared to the storms I'd survived. Palms swayed in the wind, nurses moved with calm voices, and the meals came warm. I couldn't sleep more than an hour at a time. I kept hearing the same sound, not gunfire, not shell bursts, but the click of my own voice on the radio headset, the rhythm of code, words that had meant survival, words that had become ghosts. There was a doctor named Lieutenant Abrams, a Jewish man from Brooklyn. He sat with me under a mango tree one morning and asked me if I believed in the soul. I told him I didn't know anymore. He said, "Sometimes, Yazzie, the worst damage doesn't show up on an X-ray." That stuck with me. Other Marines came and went from the station. A few recognized me. One even shook my hand and said I'd saved his squad at Sugarloaf Hill. I didn't remember it. Or maybe I didn't want to. In August, rumors started spreading. Whispers of a new weapon, something big, had hit Japan. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, one bomb for each city. Tens of thousands dead in seconds. We didn't believe it at first, but then the officers confirmed it. "The war is over," they said, just like that. No final battle, no last island, just 2 flashes, 2 cities gone. I sat in a chapel alone that night, not to pray, not exactly, but to remember all that we'd survived, all that we'd lost. And I felt something strange. Not joy, not relief, just emptiness. Like the war had slipped through our fingers before we knew how to stop being soldiers. They offered me a discharge or redeployment to Japan as part of the occupation. I chose to go home, not because I was finished, but because I was broken. The journey home was long. Guam to Hawaii, Hawaii to San Francisco, then by rail to Gallup, New Mexico, and from there by truck to the Navajo Nation. I didn't recognize the land at first. Everything was too quiet, too dry. The silence hit me harder than the bombs had. When I walked up the path to my mother's house, she was hanging laundry. She turned, looked at me, and dropped the wet sheet. She didn't run to me. She just stood there. Then slowly, she raised her hand and touched my face. And for the first time since the war began, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because I was still here. In the weeks that followed, I barely left the Hogan. People came by, elders, cousins, neighbors. Some had lost sons, some had gotten letters, but never bodies. They asked me questions, hoping I could explain what had happened out there. But how do you explain Iwo Jima? How do you explain caves filled with fire? How do you explain the sound of a language saving lives? I visited the local school. The teacher asked me to speak a few words about my experience. I stood in front of the children and looked at their wide, curious faces. I said one thing, "Ta shudi," it's okay to remember. Then I sat down. They never gave us medals right away. We weren't in the history books. Our code was classified until 1968. We couldn't talk about it, not even to our families. But we remembered. We remembered every syllable that saved a life, every phrase that never failed. Some days, I still wake up speaking in code, still hear the click of static, still expect the scream of shells. But other mornings I hear wind in the cottonwoods, the rustle of cornfields, my nephew playing by the stream, and I realize the wound is still there, but it doesn't bleed as much. After the welcome wore off and the flags were folded, silence returned, not just to the land but to me. No more orders, no more radios, no more phrases sent into the storm, just long open skies and the weight of memory. Back on the reservation, things hadn't changed much, and that was its own kind of shock. The sheep still wandered, the red dust still clung to your boots. My uncle still smoked the same rolled cigarettes, and the trading post still smelled like creosote and dried beans. But something in me had shifted. I tried ranch work, fixing fences, herding, even working freight on the line from Gallup. But no matter where I stood, the Pacific came back to me. In the wind between cliffs, I heard the thump of mortars. In the crackle of brush fire, I heard the hiss of napalm. Even the quiet had a shape I recognized. like the quiet that came right before the shelling started. My mother kept asking when I'd come back. She meant when I'd smile again, when I'd eat like before, when I'd sleep through the night. I couldn't give her that. One night in October, a man I didn't recognize came to our door. He was missing 2 fingers and wore a stitched-up cavalry coat. He introduced himself as Private Ben Begay. He'd served in the 27th Infantry Division at Saipan. He said, "You're Yazzie, right?" "You were code." I nodded. Ben took off his cap. His voice dropped. "You saved my company, June 16, 1944. Called in smoke just before we were flanked. I never forgot the words. I didn't understand 'em, but I felt 'em." We sat for 2 hours on the porch, barely speaking. When he left, he gave me a small silver coin with a hole drilled through the center. "Found it on the beach," he said. "Keep it." I still have it. The others started to trickle back, the boys from Window Rock, Chinle, Shiprock, some with limbs missing, some with eyes that wouldn't meet yours. We didn't talk about the war much, but we understood each other in silence. That was a strange thing. We had spoken so loudly in the service, and now we spoke so little. The Bureau of Indian Affairs sent a letter offering education benefits. I thought about college, maybe engineering or history, but I didn't go. Something about sitting in a city classroom after calling fire on ridgelines felt like a different universe. Instead, I started teaching. Not in a school, but at the chapter house. I taught boys to speak Navajo again, not because of code, but because of culture. Our language had saved lives, but here it was still being silenced in schools. Some of them had stopped speaking it, afraid. Others had never been taught. I told them, if they ever try to take it from you, just remember, this language fought a war and never lost. In March 1946, I received a package from Washington. Inside was a certificate, in recognition of distinguished service. No medal, no ceremony, just paper. But folded inside the envelope was a typed note from a Marine officer I didn't know. "Without your voice, we wouldn't be here. Semper Fi." I read it twice. Then I tucked it into the code book I kept locked in an old footlocker under my bed. Spring came early that year. I planted corn with my uncle and watched the river swell again. The world seemed softer somehow, but I knew it hadn't forgotten. Neither had I. Sometimes I'd see the ghosts, not like phantoms, no, just flashes. A radio perched on a rock, a boot half buried in ash, the edge of a helmet just visible over a hill. I didn't chase them. They didn't want saving, just remembering. That autumn I visited a school near Fort Defiance. The principal asked me to speak to the children. I looked out at the rows of faces, all brown like mine, all wide-eyed. I didn't tell them about Peleliu or Iwo Jima or the corpses in Okinawa caves. I told them this. They tried to take our language from us, but we turned it into a shield, into a weapon they couldn't break. Never forget, you come from warriors, not just with guns, but with stories. The kids clapped. One little boy raised his hand and asked, "Did you ever get scared?" I said, "Every day." He smiled like I'd told him a secret. Maybe I had. I kept the letters in a tin box beneath my bed. Some were finished, some half-written. A few were just lines scribbled on the back of rations wrappers or pages torn from code books. I never mailed them, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know where they'd go, or if anyone would want to open them. One letter was to Frank Chi, my spotter at Iwo Jima. I'd pulled him out of a crater while the sky came down in fire. He lived, but we lost touch after the war. He was from Tohachi, I think, or maybe Kayenta. I started that letter 12 times. Frank, you remember the beach, right? The way the sand felt like it was swallowing our boots, like the whole island wanted to erase us. But then I'd stop. What else was there to say? Sometimes I imagined sending it just so someone would know what we'd seen, the things we never told the folks back home, not because we were ashamed, but because we didn't know how. Another was to my father. He died in 1938, years before I enlisted, a miner, quiet, tough, with hands like stone. We barely spoke. But sometimes I'd imagine sitting with him after the war, drinking bitter coffee, telling him how our words, the same words his mother had taught him, had saved hundreds of lives. He wouldn't have smiled, but I think he would have nodded. And there were letters I never even started. To the parents of a Marine from Arkansas who bled out on my lap while I chanted a code phrase in his ear. To a Japanese soldier I found half buried and still breathing near Naha, whom I tried to comfort with the only word I knew in his language, Anata. To the girl I met once in San Diego who danced barefoot to radio jazz and said, "Promise me you'll come back with all your pieces." I didn't. Winter of '46, the elders invited me to a night chant ceremony. Not for healing exactly, though maybe it was. We sat around the fire in the hogan, faces glowing red and gold, and one of the old singers, Hostin Jim, asked if I wanted to speak. I told a story of the coral cave on Peleliu, where we found women and children hiding behind Japanese troops, of how one boy clutched a carving of a horse, of how we couldn't save them all. The fire crackled. Then Hostin said, "You brought their names back. That's enough." In early 1947, I traveled east. First time I'd seen Washington, D.C. A group of us code talkers were brought in, not for medals, but for interviews. Historians with clean suits and pens wanted to know how it worked. How did you keep the code secure? What was your greatest moment in the war? Do you think your people were finally accepted? We answered what we could, but inside I wanted to ask them, did you know we weren't allowed to vote in every state while we were fighting your war? Did you know we weren't citizens when we were drafted? Did you know we prayed in a language you once tried to silence? They didn't ask that. In the hotel that night, I sat by the window and tried to finish another letter, this time to myself. You got through it. You held the line. You used your grandfather's tongue to speak a new kind of thunder. You'll never be the same. But that's not always a curse. I folded it, unsigned, and left it between the pages of a book I never finished reading. One day, maybe those letters will be read. Maybe a child of mine, or a child of someone I saved, will find that box and try to make sense of it all. The jokes scribbled in code, the blood stains in the margins, the sketches of islands I still dream about. And they'll know. We weren't heroes because we carried rifles. We were heroes because we carried a language across the fire and didn't let it die. The war never really ended. Not for me, not for most of us, but time has a way of smoothing the jagged edges. The nightmares come less often now. The names come easier. The grief stays, like an old scar. But the shame, that faded long ago, and I am still here, still breathing. By 1948, the world had changed. Soldiers came home and tried to become farmers, teachers, gas station attendants. The cities roared with jazz and steel and stories of victory. And we, the ones who served without medals, without headlines. We tried to live again. I married a girl from Sile, a weaver with strong hands and eyes like winter dusk. Her name was Anna, and she didn't ask about the war. Not once. She just said, "You're home now," and I believed her. We built a small house not far from where I was born. Our first child came in spring, a boy with quiet eyes. I named him Ben, after the private who'd once handed me a silver coin and vanished into the wind. The world forgot us for a long time. The Code Talkers. They kept our work secret for decades. No parades, no headlines, no medals, not even a thank you. But we remembered. We remembered the sound of Navajo crackling through static. We remembered the way our voices held back death, if only for a few more minutes. We remembered the places where our words found meaning, places like Tarawa, Saipan, Paleliu, Okinawa, and eventually, they remembered us too. In 1968, the code was declassified. The phone rang a few days later. A newspaper in Phoenix wanted an interview, then a school, then a senator. By the 1980s, I was traveling across the country, speaking at universities and veterans' halls. I stood before crowds, told the same stories I once kept hidden, and every time I said them aloud, I felt some part of the silence lift. One boy in Kansas asked me, "Do you ever wish you hadn't fought?" I said, "I wish we didn't have to." Then I added, "But I'm proud of what we did, because we fought with something they could never take, our language." 2001, Washington, D.C. I stood in the Capitol Rotunda with 7 other surviving code talkers. President George W. Bush handed each of us the Congressional Gold Medal. He said our words were a weapon unique to this country and critical to victory. I thought about my father. I thought about how he was told not to speak Navajo in school, how they punished him for using the tongue of his ancestors. And now here we were, honored because that same tongue had helped win the war. That was the victory, not the medal, the memory. Now the years have caught up to me. My hands don't work the way they used to. My legs ache. Sometimes I forget what day it is, but I still remember the code, every phrase, every symbol, every breath that carried life across the sea. I sit under the same sky now, on a wooden chair outside my home, watching the wind move through the sagebrush. My grandson brings me water. My great-granddaughter asks to hear about the islands of fire. I tell her some things, not all. She's young. The world will teach her enough. But I teach her the words. Besh Bihain, iron that speaks. She giggles. I smile. When I'm gone, the war stories will fade. The battles will blend. The names will be carved in stone. But our voice, the one they couldn't break, it still echoes in every child who learns it, in every wind that crosses the mesas, in every syllable that once turned fire into silence. I am the last of my platoon, but I am still breathing. And as long as I am, so is the code, so is the story, so is the soul of a people who never stopped speaking, even when the world stopped listening.